Chapter 6. Blaine stood frozen for a second while wonder hammered at him, and it was surprise and bafflement, rather than either fear or anger, that held him frozen there. Surprise that, of all people, it should be Freddie Bates. Freddie, no longer the aimless man about town, the inconsequential mystery man in town that was full of such as he, but an agent of fishhook and, apparently, a very able one. And another thing, that Kirby Rand had known and had allowed him to walk out of the office and go down the elevator, but grabbing for a phone as soon as he had reached the corridor to put Freddie on the job. It had been clever, Blaine admitted to himself, much more clever than he himself had been. There had never been a moment that he had suspected Rand felt anything was wrong, and Freddie, when he picked him up, had been his normal, ineffectual self. Anger soaked slowly into him to replace the wonder. Anger that he had been taken in, that he had been trapped by such a jerk as Freddie. "We'll just walk outside," said Freddie, "like the friends we are. And I'll take you back to have a talk with Rand. No fuss, no fight, but very gentlemanly. We would not want to do anything, either one of us, to cause Charlene embarrassment." "No," said Blaine. "No, of course we wouldn't." His mind was racing, seeking for a way, looking for an out, anything at all that would get him out of this, for he was not going back. No matter what might happen, he wasn't going back with Freddie. He felt the pinkness stir as if it were coming out. "No!" yelled Blaine. "No!" But it was too late. The pinkness had crawled out and it filled his brain, and it was still himself, but someone else as well. He was two things at once, and it was most confusing, and something strange had happened. The room became as still as death, except for the groaning of the clock upon the wall, and that was strange as well, for until this very moment the clock had done no groaning. It had whirred, but never groaned. Blaine took a swift step forward, and Freddie didn't move. He stayed there, with the hand thrust in the pocket. And yet another step, and still Freddie barely stirred. His eyes stayed stiff and staring, and he didn't blink. But his face began to twist, a slow and tortured twist, and the hand in the pocket moved, but so deliberately that one only was aware of a sort of stirring, as if the arm and the thing the hand clutched in the pocket were waking from deep sleep. And yet another step, and Blaine was almost on him, with his fist moving like a piston. Freddie's mouth dropped slowly open, as if the jaw hinge might be rusty, and his eyelids came creeping down in the caricature of a blink. Then the fist exploded on his jaw. Blaine hit where he was aiming, and he hit with everything he had, his torso twisting to follow through the blow. Even as he hit, and the pain of contact slashed across his knuckles and tingled in his wrist, he knew it was all wrong, for Freddie had scarcely moved, had not even tried to defend himself. Freddie was falling, but not as one should fall. He was falling slowly, deliberately, as a tree will topple when the final cut is made, in slow motion. He crumpled toward the floor, and as he fell his hand finally cleared the pocket, and there was a gun in it. The gun slipped from his flaccid fingers and beat him to the floor. Blaine bent to scoop it up, and he had it in his hand before Freddie hit the floor, and he stood there, with the gun in his hand, watching Freddie finally strike the floor, not actually striking it, but just sort of settling down on it and relaxing in slow motion on the surface. The clock still groaned upon the wall, and Blaine swung around to look at it, and saw that the second hand was barely crawling across the numbered face, crawling where it should have galloped, and groaning when it should have whirred, and the clock, Blaine told himself, had gone crazy too. There was something wrong with time. The creeping hand and Freddie's slow reaction was evidence of that. Time had been slowed down, and that was impossible. Time did not slow down. Time was a universal constant. But if time somehow had slowed down, why had not he been a party to it? Unless, of course, unless time had stayed the way it was, and he had been speeded up, had moved so fast that Freddy had not had the time to act, had been unable to defend himself, could under no circumstances have gotten the gun out of his pocket. Blaine held his fist out in front of him and looked at the gun. It was a squat and ugly thing, and it had a deadly bluntness. Freddy had not been fooling, nor was Fishhook fooling. You do not pack a gun in a little game all filled with lightness and politeness. You do not pack a gun unless you're prepared to use it, and Freddy, there was no doubt of that, had been prepared to use it. Blaine swung back toward Freddy, and he was still upon the floor, and he seemed to be most restful. It would be quite a little while before Freddy would be coming round. Blaine dropped the gun into his pocket and turned toward the door, and as he did so, he glanced up at the clock, and the second hand had barely moved from where he'd seen it last. He reached the door and opened it, and took one last glance back into the room. The room was bright with chrome, still stark in its utility, and the one untidy thing within it was Freddy sprawled upon the floor. Blaine stepped out of the door and moved along the flagstone walk that led to the long stone stairway that went slanting down across the great cliff face. A man was lounging at the head of the stairs, and he began to straighten slowly as Blaine raced down the walk toward him. The light from one of the upstairs windows shone across the face of the straightening man, and Blaine saw the lines of outraged surprise, as if they were sculptured lines in a graven face. "Sorry, pal," said Blaine. He shot his arm out, stiff from the shoulder, with the palm spread flat, and caught the graven face. The man reeled backward slowly, step by cautious step, tilting farther and farther backward with each step. In another little while, he'd fall flat upon his back. Blaine didn't wait to see. He went running down the stairs. Beyond the dark lines of parked vehicles stood a single car, with its taillights gleaming and its motor humming softly. It was Harriet's car, Blaine told himself, but it was headed the wrong way. Not down the road toward the canyon's mouth, but into the canyon's maw. And that was wrong, he knew, because the road pinched out a mile or two beyond. He reached the bottom of the steps and threaded his way among the cars out into the road. Harriet sat waiting in the car, and he walked around it and opened the door. He slid into the seat. Weariness hit him, a terrible, bone-aching weariness, as if he had been running, as if he'd run too far. He sank into the seat and looked at his hands lying in his lap and saw that they were trembling. Harriet turned to look at him. "It didn't take you long," she said. "I got a break," said Blaine. "I hurried." She put the car in gear and it floated up the road, its air jets thrumming and the canyon walls picking up the thrumming to fling it back and forth. "I hope," said Blaine, "you know where you are going. The road ends up here a ways." "Don't worry, Shep. I know." He was too tired to argue. He was all beaten out. And he had a right to be, he told himself, for he had been moving 10 times, or 100 times, faster than he should, than the human body ever had been intended to. He had been using energy at a terrific rate. His heart had beat the faster, his lungs had worked the harder, and his muscles had gone sliding back and forth at an astounding rate. He lay quietly, his mind agape at what had happened, and wondering, too, what had made it happen, although the wonder was a formalized and an academic wonder, for he knew what it was. The pinkness had faded out of him, and he went hunting it and found it, snug inside its den. "Thanks," he said to it, although it seemed a little funny that he should be thanking it, for it was part of him. It was inside his skull. It sheltered in his brain, and yet not a part of him, not yet a part of him, but a skulker no longer, a fugitive no more.